It may not be about boots on the ground, but the UK is at war every day, according to its top military officer. Constant cyber attacks are coming from Russia and elsewhere, he says. Are we now in an era of constant conflict? Welcome to Roundtable. For me, David Foster. Imagine a time when there's no distinction between peace and war. As dramatic as it may sound, that time is right now, says the UK's top military official.
The defeat of the Soviet Union in the 1990s made the USA the undisputed global superpower. For a short time in history, Western powers and academics had a clear idea of what absolute victory or defeat looked like. Now, the rise of Russia, China and others has changed warfare, according to some analysts, who say it has become a low-lying but constant struggle between competing powers. Military analysts say Russia is going beyond troops on the ground into what's called hybrid war. That employs tactics including covert operations, election interference and cyber attacks against Western nations. Britain's most senior military officer says Russia engages in daily cyber warfare against the UK, so the distinction between peacetime and war has effectively disappeared. This contrasts with the USA. It's spent over $6 trillion on the war on terror since 2001 in costly military adventures in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria and other countries. Despite President Trump declaring victory against Daesh,
the ISIS caliphate has been decimated.
The violence in Syria continues, with no end in sight. The US war in Afghanistan removed the Taliban, but only temporarily. If wars are no longer won or lost, have we entered an era of perpetual conflict?
Very pleased to say that with me at the round table we have Professor Peter Roberts, Director of Military Sciences at the defence think tank RUSI. He served in the UK's Royal Navy. Ofer Fridman is here, the author of Russian Hybrid Warfare in the Israeli Defence Forces for 15 years, and John Berryman, lecturer in international relations at Birkbeck University, London. John, I'm going to start with you, if I may, on this one. Sir Nick Carter, what does he mean by war in this context?
Well, war is always characterised as a rivalry, and I think the big change that's come in the last 20 years is having seen a period of great power confrontation in the Cold War. We've had 20 years of expeditionary forces being developed for operations in the developing world. And what we're seeing today, I think, or certainly since 2014, is a combination of both the irregular and regular forms of warfare, which is, I think, one of the definitions you can ask.
What happened in 2014 then?
Well, Ukraine and Crimea.
Okay, and he says the definitions between war and peace no longer exist. Which one of you wants to pick that one up?
I mean, to me, I think that this is a really difficult thing to contextualise, because this is us talking about how we understand war and peace and our strict divide between these two. We regard them as two poles. We've romanticised them. We've fictionalised what they represent. And actually, what we're not talking about, the really important part of this conversation, is what do our competitors think? And actually, one could say that Russia didn't make this decision in 2014. Indeed, 2014 didn't characterise a huge change in their foreign policy from what they'd done before. Go back through Georgia in 2008, go back to Chechnya operations before that. You know, since 1996, they've spent 1/3 of their defence budget on electronic warfare equipment. Just because they hadn't performed how we expected them to doesn't mean that they haven't regarded themselves in a state of unwar or non-peace, as some people call it. But in their minds, you know, this is competition. It's conflict. Everything is on a
have they
scale.
changed, or since 1996 has the rest of the world been slow to catch on to this idea?
I think the rest of the world has been entirely ignorant of the fact that they have continued their behaviour in very much the same way that they've done over the last 120 years. I mean, it is humanity's natural state in the sort of long arc of history is constant competition, sometimes violent, sometimes less violent, but it's always in competition. And the fact that we're just recognising these behaviours because they're now manifest between China and Russia and the United States, and we're now part players in it. Just because we're coming to recognise it doesn't mean that it's just happened.
I suppose what I'm wondering is images of war are explosive in more ways than one. Are we seeing a return to times before big battles, etc., when there was, as Peter's saying, constant competition, constant conflict? Are we back to the future, if you like?
Well, I would say that international relations, and I will agree with my colleagues, are characterized by competition. Players on international arena are always in constant competition. Sometimes this competition can be peaceful, in most desirable case. Even between allies and partners, there is competition. It's just peaceful competition. Sometimes it can be hostile competition, and sometimes it can go to war. And it has been the state of international relations since the beginning of international relations. There is very little new in that. The transfer, by the way, the shift from peaceful competition to hostile competition, it's a matter of decision, it's a matter of perspective. How we characterize it, much less about what the adversary does. So we decide, once we feel that adversary doesn't play according to the rules or plays dirty, we can say, okay, from peaceful competition, we are now in hostile competition. It's called hostile international relations. It has characterized the international relations for centuries, if not longer.
I have plenty of questions, but don't always wait for me. I think
No,
you're
so
dying
I
to say
was
something,
gonna
and I'll come back to you, John,
one
if I may. Let's see.
One of the really interesting pieces there was using the term rules. And our understanding of the rules versus how others understand the rules. So, we have this, Western politicians rely on this great thing called the rules-based order. It's a theory about how the world operates. Now, to Western politicians, the rules-based order is a set of behaviours, norms, whereby states behave in a certain way that maintains the status quo. Nothing changes. No one wants to change anything. And yet for Russia, for China, for Iran, for North Korea, for the Houthis, for Bashar al-Assad, they do not believe in those rules as we believe in them. So their rules are different. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That is the way we've understood rules since the 18th century. That's the way that rules have always been. They're about rules governing behaviours in competition, during competition, not designed to keep the status quo down. We're talking about how rules govern something different. The difference is because we're talking at cross purposes between how we understand rules and how they understand rules, the behaviours are changing.
Okay.
I think the new factor is that the presumption that rules of international order would be adhered to by this entity called the international community was possible to adhere to in the 20 years in the post-Cold War period before the resurgence, if you like, of at least two major great power competitors for the West, Russia itself and, of course, China. And to that extent, therefore, we're not experiencing something new. We're going back to the future, if you like, great power geopolitical rivalry, which was at one time dismissed as part of a precursor of a postmodern world of international independence. That's all being swept away, and we're back to the reality of what Clausewitz said.
And this
Clausewitz says the war is a continuation of policy by other means, and that's the essence of, I think, what we're...
And this, just let me clarify for my sake here, that this period you're talking about, which was the rules-based order, prior to which and post which perhaps these rules didn't apply, was 18th century to late 20th century.
I'm not saying the rules didn't apply. The rules have always applied, but we regard them as a rules-based order. And we've romanticised them, we've fictionalised them. No one else understands them as a rules-based order. China doesn't understand it as a rules-based order. They have rules of competition.
But that held sway because we were able to subjugate,
There is important clarification just to kind of to continue exactly what my colleague said here. When we're talking about rules, there are rules, but we're not going back to the Cold War, the great power where the two main great powers defined the rules. We're going back to the 19th century, to the multipolar system. Where we have China with its own rules and understanding of these rules, Russia, its own regional powers, their own understanding. What happened in the last 20 years or 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was an assumption that we're living under one set of rules, which is the Western one, where now we can...
and that was possible because of the power that the Western militaries and democracies
lack of capability of other powers to challenge.
So let's get into the practicalities of this, and I don't mind who picks up on it. How has this changed conflict?
Well, I think going to clarify on the rules of the international order, this thing we've been just discussing, I think was really codified in the post-Cold War period with American dominance in the international institutions which were created then. And to some extent, those were never challenged as a consequence of the weakness of the non-Western adversaries. And all we're seeing today, therefore, is a greater challenge now from those who are going to play by their rules and by their games. Although I would emphasise, I don't think we shouldn't exaggerate too much. There's still a lot of interest. For example, Russia wants to remain a part of a United Nations Security Council and is not wanting to challenge the preeminence of that institution. So we shouldn't exaggerate the degree to which we're in a sort of new, lawless jungle world.
But I suppose what I'm trying to get at is how is it changing? How do you recognise how it's changing, and how do you counter?
Yes. So So first of all, to continue, I will
Just
say
bear it in mind.
every
It's only a
generation,
question.
when you study history and how historians were describing their generation and events during their time, apparently we has always lived during the most exciting times with the biggest change.
Okay. I think we've established that we aren't the most important people, that things were like this maybe 200 years ago. They are where they used to be before a slight change in world order. How do you recognise the enemy in this? How do you counter the enemy? I'll give up if nobody answers this time, fourth time.
I think just to my own summary of what we've just been looking at is that we had a long period of competition between a number of great powers in a multipolar world. Then we had a 50-year interlude of Cold War, bipolar, managed confrontation. We're now back to a new multipolar world, perhaps more truly global than the old European-dominated world. In terms of identifying adversaries, I think you can see today that China's meteoric economic and military development at the moment is beginning to, I think, come back to where we're at. I think we are at a point where we can begin to see that the American priority will shift from Europe. They've been pulled back by the Ukraine crisis, but in a longer term, I think there's no question the United States will be focusing increasingly on East Asia and the China challenge. And to that extent, Europe, therefore, will perhaps no longer be the preeminent centre of a world system, which it's been accustomed to be for about 500 years.
Let me try and answer your previous question, which we all assiduously avoided. To me, the Western actors would recognise this situation when other states or entities aren't doing what they want. So when Syria is using 300 times in the last few years chemical weapons on a battlefield, well, we don't want that to happen, therefore we need to recognise that. When a state invades the sovereignty of another state, such as Russia did in Ukraine or in Georgia before that, or a state supports a proxy which then uses armed force to take down missiles or infrastructure and others, like the Iranians use the Houthis or Hezbollah or Hamas. Or it could be the fact that they are doing things which you don't want to recognise. So China claiming large swathes of the South China Seas, which you don't believe they should do. Now, these are all challenges to your understanding of the rules.
Would you add to that, just quickly, the interference in other people's supposedly democratic processes?
Speak about that. So what I will add, it's not about necessarily what the adversary or others do. It's that the West will perceive them as a hostile. For example, when Russians hacked into Democratic Party during the last elections in the United States, everybody said in the West, and especially in the US, it's a hostile action. And therefore, relationship between Russia and the United States was defined as a hostile relationship. Now, when the United States tapped mobile phones of certain European leaders, apparently these countries didn't say that now we're in a hostile relationship with the United States. Whether in terms of action, it's the same action, more or less. It's a matter of perception and the willingness to define these actors as hostile actors. It's not necessarily...
It's how you react.
It's how you perceive.
And then how you react.
And then obviously how do you...
I think it's less about how you react. I mean, you know...
Yeah, it's how you perceive.
300 uses of chemical weapons, you know, 3 strikes in response to 3 incidents, but the rest of them, the 297 that we used, well, that's fine. Let's not worry about those. You know, a chemical attack on, UK soil, the assassination of someone in Germany, shutting down a TV station in France, had some very serious diplomatic consequences of diplomats being returned to Moscow, but nothing else.
I mean, we've got to be careful not to get into situations of erecting double standards on stilts, if I could put it in that mixed metaphor. Enormous hoo-ha in 2016 at the claimed intervention by Russia in America's political developments. Track back 1996, American plumbers were in Moscow fixing the presidential election to ensure that President Yeltsin would not be ousted by Zhuganov. So, for Russia, I think certainly in the current period, there seems to be a view that there's a lot of hypocrisy and double standards about the outrage which is expressed. By the way, the intervention, the changing of borders in Ukraine was a precursor in 1974 when Turkish forces went into Cyprus, which when I last checked my map was part of and is part of the European Union.
No matter who you are, no matter what your views, how do you counter these kind of threats? Because you can't have your guns pointing in every single direction. And I'm not just talking about left and right, I'm talking about up and down as well. Is there a clever way of dealing with this?
Most of the threats, you don't need guns to
I
counter
use that
threats.
metaphorically.
No, I understand,
but
but it's important because we, in the West, especially since the Second World War, we tend to react with guns. But actually, most of these threats do not need guns, or what I'm trying to say, they don't need military response.
So how do you
it's about grand strategic response.
The military are always playing catch-up with political developments. And I'll come back to the fact that most Western forces were geared for expeditionary activities for about 25 years. And it's been a bit of a shock, therefore, that they're now confronted once more by peer competitors like the Russian Federation. And what you're seeing, of course, is a scrambling to re-equip and develop military equipment suitable for a potential conflict between major powers.
So the best brains...
The last American tanks left Europe in 2013, and they're now, of course, being shipped back into Germany and deployed in the suburbs of St. Petersburg.
So the best brains rather than the best brawn. Is that the answer?
Well... I mean, it's really...
I'm sorry if I'm being simplistic, but I just sit here listening to
it's really important to have this conversation because, we associate the act of deterrence now with ballistic missile-armed submarines, which actually have very little utility in terms of broader deterrence. It's about a society's response. It's about proportional responses, and it's about options. What politicians must have is options, the options that matter to the adversary. So Russia makes another attack. It shouldn't be expelling people. It should be letting Georgia join NATO.
Or switch the lights off in Moscow.
But I mean, but switching the lights off in Moscow wouldn't achieve very much.
But doesn't it show how far you could go if you needed to?
I mean, it's not really a very effective indicator. Okay. If you, President Putin, if you threaten to allow Georgia into NATO or make overtures toward Finland right on their border or talk about more military interaction and NATO support for Ukraine, that gets the muscles twitching. So it's understanding what pinch points they are, but it's also, for the West, understanding what the red lines are. And I don't think the West has done a good... has really articulated what those are. What do the Russians understand about...
For Russia might be inviting Ukraine into NATO.
It might well be, but the point is, the West hasn't laid down its red lines. Is it chemical weapons usage? Is it nuclear weapon testing? Is it interference in elections? Is it chemical warfare against someone in a city? Is it taking down a TV station? Is it destroying infrastructure? What are the red lines?
Sorry, I'm going to let John come in because he was halfway through a sentence.
Yeah, I think there was a recognition of red lines in the Bucharest NATO summit. which was a very important summit indeed, there was a recognition there that it would not
Which
be
was
wise.
when?
2008, which was not, it would not be wise, this is in the January before the events in August, it was recognised then that it would not be wise for NATO to consider taking into whatever the timescale, either Georgia or Ukraine. There's a recognition that where you can argue in the New World Order, states have a right to join alliances of their choice, yes, but the alliances do not have a requirement to accept as members potential liabilities that might actually get them into a war. So I do think there have been points, and it was only Angela Merkel who formulated a
I know I said you could...
that got a statement that there will be in the long term Georgia and Ukraine in NATO, but it's not going to happen, I think, in most
I
of
did
our
say
lifetime.
beforehand, both on air and privately, you could say whatever you want, whenever you want to. But there are a couple of points I want to try and get to here. Should we be thankful, perhaps, that it is at this stage because there are going to be fewer physical casualties, perhaps?
Well, nobody promises that there will be fewer. Nobody can promise that there will be no Third World War, which will be much more damaging than the previous two together. So,
but this constant balancing act.
Well, it's a matter of deterrence,
perhaps, or red
it's a matter of
lines.
deterrence. Just to continue what we said in red lines and so on.
Yeah.
Any deterrence is based on three principles, which is capability, credibility, and communications. The most important one is credibility. So we put in red lines, but to what extent these red lines are credible, militarily speaking, when we put these red lines to Russia. NATO puts these red lines to Russia.
But
to what extent
in the sense that there are not as many people dying at this moment as died when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I suppose we should be thankful for that. But is there always a calculation?
Well, it's
that it's not going to take very much to push it over?
These kind of relationships...
Is this what we call a phony war?
I think there's always a danger in looking to the future. Economic forecasts, in my view, have been always
that's for another programme.
On every occasion wrong, and I think predicting the future in terms of warfare have similar difficulties. Yogi Berra, that great philosopher, once said, be careful about predicting the predictions, especially about the future. And I think that's a problem with warfare, that you particularly the possibility of not war by design, but war by accident.
But should we be thankful in the sense that it has got to this? Because, and I used the words just now, this is effectively a phony war, or not? Peter?
No, I think we need to recognise what it is, which is a competition, and we are close to mass casualties. And we care about casualties. It's one of our weaknesses. We place people at the forefront of one of the things that we hold as the greatest strength of our military capability, that's deeply seated value in our society, that people matter most. So if you're an adversary, a competitor, what do you pick out as a vulnerability to which you might attack? It's the West's weaknesses about people, about casualties. The Russians don't care. The Chinese don't care. Chinese slaughter millions of people a year. The Russians don't care about losing a few hundred troops to their own artillery. You know, so the differences in understanding are huge. And us thinking that we're in a relatively wonderful place simply because it's a phony war, because no one's dying on our side, I think is a bit of a false construct, and we just need to be very wary of it. We are in a state of deep, long-term competition on an arc of instability and violence. At the moment, the violence is relatively low, but it takes accident, design, miscalculation, misunderstanding of thresholds or red lines.
So perhaps after we come to the end of this, more dangerous perhaps than ever.
It's a slippery slope. And which this kind of relationship or hostile relationship or hostile competition, it's a slippery slope where during the Cold War, at least there were red lines that both sides understood. By the way, if you ask me, both sides during the Cold War believed that the other is crazy enough for the first strike. And this was actually what stopped both sides from using
MAD, destruction. Yeah.
Nowadays, I believe that credibility is missing. None of the sides believes that the other is crazy enough to strike, and this is a very slippery slope.
The belief in rationality of your opponent is something that doesn't work in war. You need to understand that the belligerent opposite you is irrational, not rational. You can't rely on an audacity of hope, an optimistic belief, the preordained right to victory that the West sort of espouses. None of those things exist in reality.
I will disagree.
I do wish.
Excellent.
I wish we had the time. Okay. I wish we had the time, but we are. Well, we've run out. Absolutely. I've even got a couple of quotes from Sun Tzu here. Who wishes to fight must first count the cost. The art of war 2,500 years ago. I suppose nothing really has changed. And I have to say that when I've been involved in any conflicts as a reporter, it is those where you don't know where the next bullet's coming from, which direction. And you seem to be suggesting that there are multiple threats out there now, which makes the world a much more dangerous and volatile place. I wish we could carry on for a very long time. Thank you very much indeed, even if you didn't answer too many of my questions. You've got your thoughts out there. Thank you for watching this roundtable. I'm David Foster. We hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.